All right, I think everyone is joined now, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to another FAFP webinar series. We're excited to continue this webinar series this afternoon, and glad that all of you were able to join us. And of course, we thank all of you for your ongoing support of FAFP, especially this year, where we moved on into this virtual format in lieu of our normal educational conference. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please keep your video and audio off through the duration of today's program. We'll ask our guest, Dr. Kniel, to answer questions from the audience at the end of her presentation, and we'll be monitoring the chat box, which you can find along the bottom of your screen, and facilitating the questions with Callie. So please just enter your questions in that chat box. We're also recording the program today, and we'll be posting that at fafp.net. And please do check out our webpage there, which has been revamped recently. So today we're glad to welcome Dr. Callie Kniel. Callie's a professor of microbial food safety in the Department of Animal and Food Sciences at the University of Delaware. Dr. Kniel's laboratory explores issues of food safety and public health that involve transmission of viruses, protozoa, and pathogenic bacteria. Dr. Kniel's work further explores how food microbiology and food safety can be integrated across the K-16 curriculum in a novel way through connecting science to other topics. Callie co-chairs the One Health program at the University of Delaware. One Health is a holistic way of thinking about how the health of our environment is intertwined with human health and animal health. Food safety is an outstanding example of a topic with a One Health focus. Dr. Kniel is a member of the Capital Area Association for Food Protection and is currently the president of IAFP. And we're glad that she was able to join us today. So Callie, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Travis. Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor to be here with you today. I am very sorry I missed meeting with everyone in person back in May, but this is really wonderful. Thank you for having me. Can you see my slide okay? Everything looks good?
Yes, ma'am, we can.
Great, thank you. Okay, so before I jump into One Health, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for being an incredible affiliate. All of you do so much throughout the year. And I know at IAFP, we are incredibly fortunate to have affiliates like you, and just wanted to take a second to say if you have had a lapse in your membership, with I know some of us having an unusual schedule this year when it comes to the IAFP meeting, if you have had that, if you get a chance to perhaps renew your membership, and thank you, those of you who are members. There's a lot of benefits that come with our membership, including the monthly IAFP report, and then access to food protection trends. And then of course we have our flagship journal, the Journal of Food Protection as well. So just again, thank you all so much for everything that you do. You guys are an incredible association. All right, so now back to One Health. So I think it's a topic that if you're not thinking about it already, it really is quite a big part of our lives. And today we're going to talk about it in terms of making connections, connecting aspects of human, animal, and environmental health. And we can certainly contextualize that very easily in today's world and in the aspect of the pandemic, but we're going to try to focus that across food safety and some other aspects as well. So my colleague Ryan Arsenault and I co-chair the One Health program for our college and the University of Delaware. And you can see some of the different topics that are included in that are influenza, which we'll talk about today, antibiotic resistance, and then of course the vector-borne diseases. It's really a historical concept, and it's quite a grand vision, I think, and something maybe we need to be rethinking today, right? It's been around for quite a long time. Hippocrates really talked about it when he thought of airs, waters, and places. It was used to refer to zoonosis and various linkages by a German physician in the 19th century. And really then come to a very specific area in veterinary medicine, and now it's been used also for human health, really thinking about how we need to have these collaborations, how we can be better for everyone's health, animals and humans, if we really think about those collaborations and those connections. Offices were then established in the CDC, as well as the USDA, and now multiple universities, and University of Florida, of course, also has this really great aspect of looking at One Health. And so today, you know, more than ever, perhaps, we really see this need to think about the growing population, the way we approach population growth, as well as health of animals and humans through a more problem-solving means, right? How can we do this better? And we can think about those connections. Many people who work in the food industry are already thinking about connections in the supply chain, connections to customers, connections that we make maybe in recalls and in outbreak investigations. But let's think about those more broadly too, as we think about how we might solve bigger problems that we're facing and greater challenges. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't include one slide on this, because certainly COVID-19 and the virus that causes that, SARS-CoV-2, has One Health origins, right? We think about the linkages to other animals like bats, maybe even other animals outside of bats, and those areas need to be further studied. And this is something we need to keep on our radar, and we need to make sure we're continuing to look at. But this isn't going to be a webinar on SARS-CoV-2, because I'm sure you need a little break from that. So we're going to talk a little bit more about One Health with some different diseases. But I also thought it would be of interest to think about how outside of our health aspect, many different groups are now thinking about One Health. And if you look around our environment, we are experiencing our environments a little bit differently. Being outside is very important to all of us, especially at this time. Here are some pictures of parks in cities, very busy cities like New York and Boston, and the bottom right is actually from Washington, D.C., where people are designing parks differently so that everyone can have their space, yet you can do more things in those environments. And in fact, the entire landscape architecture community has embraced One Health just this past year. They've had One Health webinars themselves, and they are really working with various landscape architects to come up with ways to better utilize our landscape, that we can do so many different things on it, but at the same time do them separately, right? So it's a very different way to think about the use of our environments in terms of One Health. So if we get back to the basics of One Health, right, we really want to think about people and animals, how we are protecting them, as well as thinking about the environment and the protection of that environment as well, to achieve the best health outcomes for everyone, right? Sustainable practices are included in that as well. And this is certainly a global idea. We've got multiple international collaborations with various communities that are working on One Health. And you've probably seen some of these numbers before, where zoonotic diseases are rampant among humans, right? About 60% of our existing diseases are zoonotic, and emerging infectious diseases are often of zoonotic origin, including SARS and COVID-19, right? So we really need to be thinking about what's going on in the environment so we can get a better understanding of human and animal health. And as food professionals, we have seen this before perhaps, but maybe you didn't think about it from a One Health perspective, that well-traveled salad, this lovely image that shows us really what a global food supply we can have just in one bowl, right? Where do all these different products come from? How were they grown? What are the environmental impacts, and what are the environmental issues that might be going on with those different food products? Is something else to think about, those connections in terms of One Health. And what's our role if we place that in a One Health context, right? We are certainly doing the best, and you all are particularly good at this, right? Securing safe and adequate food and water supply, preventing disease, trying to protect the environment at the same time. We know that foodborne illness is incredibly important across the United States. And maybe we can start to think about the emerging infectious disease in context of ecosystems, right? And we are also thinking about ecosystems when it comes to foods. And consumers are really driving this. They think about local food production, think about individual farms. We can even add agrotourism into that in terms of a growing ecosystem where there is food production that's involved, right? So we think about those connections that are going on. And that intersection of One Health and food safety can be varied. It may have multiple issues, sort of like this highway kind of goes in all different directions, right? And they look familiar in some cases, and sometimes they're very unfamiliar. Maybe today I'll give you a couple examples of both. And here's one outbreak that happened last year, and you can see it's maybe an unusual food product, but a organism that we do know quite a bit about and that we see with other foods. We think about how that One Health concept certainly extends to our animals. For many people, pets are an extension of family. And here's an example where we have a clinic with our pre-vet program at University of Delaware that I work with, and they go into downtown Wilmington and they set up a clinic where they can take care of people. So we have human health specialists that join the students as well as the pre-vet students to take care of their animals. And so really looking at the health of humans and people and humans and animals together at the same time. If we go back to food safety, you can see listed here many different products that were involved in multi-state outbreaks, and they involved animals in some cases and pet food. Certainly we think about the importance of food safety and pet food. Again, those connections between our pets and humans from the aspect of care and mental health, but then also we think about people getting sick. And in fact, this is an example of that, where people were sick from handling treats, from handling these pig-eared treats. And so again, those connections are quite real on many occasions. So salmonella, as we just saw with those pig ears, is probably the epitome of a One Health food safety issue. We do see transmission that occurs with humans, animals, and plants. And here's an example of salmonella on a plant. Of course, we know multiple produce items, onions and peaches, right, that we're quite familiar with right now. But we can actually look at these interactions on a molecular level, and salmonella has a really personal relationship with plants and can actually close and open those stomata on leaves. So the plant is recognizing salmonella in a different way. Outside of plants, salmonella has been well studied to have this sort of really unique interaction with the environment. Shown in this paper, these scientists compared it to E. coli and really looked at how salmonella is unique in this way of circulating through the external environment and reacting to the external environment differently from other microorganisms. And on this graph, other scientists, again, in a One Health context, really looked at changes in the Salmonella serovars, looking at how pylori has decreased across poultry flocks, but then Enteritidis and Typhimurium have really increased, and we know that they cause severe illness in humans. And so that's, again, looking at these connections and how we're seeing these changes happen in our environment. We also know that salmonella is of extreme importance when it comes to poultry. That's important for human food as well as for the environment. When we think about how much salmonella might be out there in the environment, and there's multiple outbreaks that happen, including with backyard flocks. And we're going to talk about those a little bit more. And so I thought we'd talk for a few minutes about avian influenza. It's a virus that maybe you are familiar with, or maybe not, and something different virus to think about for a little while. And it's really a perfect fit for a One Health conversation because we're going to talk about how the environment, how wildlife and domestic animals can be also affecting human health. And so the basic premise of the concept for avian influenza is that we have viruses that can recombine in different animals, including wild birds or domestic birds, and they may spread flu to other animals, and then those animals in close contact with humans may become infected with influenza. So again, as I said, it's a really perfect One Health example. We do see an impact on human health with seasonal flu strains, millions of infections each year with different types of influenza, while the avian strains in terms of transmission into humans are relatively rare. We do have consistent concern of avian influenza in our domestic poultry flocks, and we're monitoring that as well in terms of wild bird species. As we'll talk a little bit about, so I'm at University of Delaware, as Travis mentioned, and we have more chickens in the state of Delaware than we do people. And so avian influenza, in terms of our domestic poultry production, is a really critical issue for us. And in my college, we do all the testing for avian influenza, and we're consistently monitoring for outbreaks and in discussions with our nearby states and also states across the country, because certainly, if there is an outbreak of a highly pathogenic avian influenza, there is also the chance of human health concerns there and transmission to humans. And again, people are studying and looking to make sure that we don't have pandemic flu, right? And of course, we've heard more about that recently as well. So avian strains do seem to be a little bit more commonplace in terms of animal health. Spread around the world. We'll look specifically at some of those flyway patterns in just a minute. And it's an incredibly important economic issue and does lead to billions of losses in Asia, Africa, Europe, and North America, millions and millions of dollars of loss every year across Asia. So this is a cartoon image of type A influenza. You can see those H, hemagglutinin, and N, neuraminidase. Proteins there on the outside, and that's where we get the H and the N. So you get various combinations of flu virus from antigenic drift, which is very small changes, or antigenic shift, which can be these larger changes that might happen in flu populations. And that's why when we think about our flu vaccines, which we're probably all starting to think about now, it's getting to be that time of year. And I know some of the pharmacies are offering those already. That would be a mixture of different influenza viruses, depending on what might be circulating. So there is a wide host range for influenza. And again, this is really why it makes such a perfect concept for One Health. And you can see all the different animals here. Perhaps you hadn't been thinking about the sea life, whales and other sea creatures that are involved in terms of potential transmission and harborage for influenza. You likely are thinking about waterfowl and pigs and humans, but we're going to look specifically at some of these other animals as well. And certainly those avian flu strains can adapt, right? We have seen human pandemics that have been isolated really in specific continents, when we see adaptation from waterfowl to swine. Perhaps you remember H1N1 in 2009, right? That was able to be here in the United States as well. More recently, there has been H5, H7, H9 infections that have resulted from direct transmission of poultry to humans. And so, of course, those other H and N numbers are possible as well with different recombination events that can happen. So let's look for a second back in 2015, where there was an avian influenza outbreak. You can see from the colors here on this USDA map that various commercial producers for poultry were affected, as well as some backyard flocks where AI was detected. And you can see that kind of through the middle of the country here. And then of course, California and up into the Northwest. And then the yellow is the wild birds where AI was detected. And so surveillance is really critical when it comes to avian influenza, consistent monitoring of where different types are found, and then trying to make connections and correlations between what might be happening in commercial flocks. And unfortunately, the outbreak of 2015 really led to a loss of millions and millions of birds. You can see 36 million in layers, 7 million in turkeys, as well as layer pullets. And you know, it's certainly, everybody gets hurt when we have outbreaks like this, right? It's devastating across the board. And how do these outbreaks start, right? These are really important questions. And so we're going to look at two aspects of how we might see introduction for these different outbreaks. So one is thinking about these connections that humans are making at places like wild bird or live bird markets. These are really important. If I'm where I'm sitting is very close to New York City, just a couple hours drive away, and also into New Jersey, and a couple hours south of me are Baltimore and Washington, D.C. And so right here in the Delmarva area, people have access to multiple live poultry markets. And it's been important in Delaware that producers do not take their birds back and forth and then bring them back and perhaps have commingling with our domestic poultry, because we do not want to see any of those viruses coming back and forth between live markets. If we think about what's going on specifically in Delaware, here's a little bit of a snapshot in terms of how important poultry production is to the Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia Peninsula, which sits into the Chesapeake Bay and on the side of the Atlantic. If you think about where Delaware is located, right, we have 100 million chickens every day on Delmarva in this relatively small area. It's a pretty fragile area. We think about how climate change is affecting this area in terms of surge of water and in terms of saltwater intrusion as well. And there's a lot of chickens, numbers of chickens, of course, and then of course, how much value that is worth, right? And we have seen and experienced outbreaks here. We had a high path avian influenza outbreak in 2004. It actually had just started at University of Delaware. At that time, it was very exciting, and people worked very quickly to contain this outbreak. There were a couple different hotspots across all these little dots that you see on the bottom right of your slide. Those are all individual family farms that belong to some of the different corporations that are on this area. So this is an image of Delmarva there. You can see the different states. Pink there is Virginia, blue is Maryland, and then the yellow there is Delaware. We only have 3 counties, so you can see those there, and most of our poultry is in the lower 2 counties. There were 2 big hotspots, and of course they did a lot of testing. Really important that biosecurity was implemented right away, and that people understood how viruses could be transmitted. And so since that time in 2004, there's been a lot of communication with growers about backyard flocks and live bird markets and those things. And you can see, if we look at the map of the United States, there is poultry all over the country, but it's also really centered in specific areas. And now if we were to take those maps and look at some of the flyways and think about where people are moving, first just a moment about backyard poultry, right? So really nice imagery from the CDC to help spread this message, making sure that people understand that it's really important that you reduce direct contact, think about potentially contaminated surfaces, right? And how viruses like influenza might move through the air. So here's that flyway map that I was mentioning. So if you think about on the right-hand side, the United States, and we saw that there was clustering of some of those poultry production areas down through the center here, down from the Great Lakes, down to the bottom in the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see there are flyway patterns there. And this map, actually, if you look around the world, you can see there are multiple flyway patterns from some of these major migratory birds that are, we think about wildlife, they're really quite amazing, right? Their wingspan and how long they fly and how far they fly. It's just amazing. And you can see where they cross continents. And so typically, if we think about where an outbreak might start, you can actually go backwards and try to follow some of these flyway patterns, and that surveillance data that scientists are getting and continuing to monitor is really critical so we can understand potential risks as well. Now, coupling with that information, we could look even further and think about intensive rice production in parts of Asia in particular, and how that might even be compounded when we think about virus presence in ducks, right? And so we look at some of these areas where you see occurrence of avian influenza in poultry, and then also in wild birds, you see some of that maps very well to each other. We see those areas, in fact, are ones where you might have heavy rice production as well as heavy production of duck meat. So there's this strong link between duck grazing patterns and rice cropping and intensity in H5N1, the highly pathogenic avian influenza that was detected there, and then also can be detected in humans as well. So really thinking about those connections, right, that are very visual on this map. Now trying to find solutions or break those connections is difficult, right? Because we're talking about people's livelihood here, we're talking about food security issues, we're talking about animal health as well. And so again, we really need that One Health perspective to try to find some solutions. You know, in North America, waterfowl fly south, and you can see that that overlaps with these lower latitude migratory wild ducks, which is also in the place where the poultry houses are. And so again, it's not easy or feasible to pick up and move a poultry house, but these are things we need to think about. So what do? Maybe you really need to intensify biosecurity. We need to have good surveillance for viruses, those kinds of things. But this type of knowledge can be really important in helping to have solutions in place before you have the outbreaks. Here's another example where these scientists were following H5N2 and H5N8, and those viruses were detected in poultry and wild birds in 2014. And you could see almost simultaneous detection there between the viruses and looking at those migratory patterns of those birds that are going from one continent to another. So again, we need really good surveillance to better understand these issues. And this surveillance is continuing across the globe. Here's some images that look at data from this summer from the OIE, and you can see across parts of Russia where we have poultry production and new outbreaks and ongoing outbreaks in terms of high path AI. So that surveillance is really critical. This is the last slide I have on this. It talks a little bit about some of the surveillance that's been happening from agencies within the United States, and they're continuing to do this. These are older numbers that I have, but they're continuing to do this, although it has decreased in nature, but who knows, maybe it'll go up. And just as we see, we really need to have good surveillance in animals when it comes to viruses. So it's not only wild birds or waterfowl that we need to be concerned with, certainly surveillance and monitoring of our interactions with swine and looking for swine influenza before that happens, that's also really important. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. We'll talk about water now. Water is certainly a critical resource. It's very critical to One Health in terms of what's going on with water in the environment, the water that humans have to drink and to use, and then also water that impacts our wildlife and our domestic animals as well. Many scientists are asking questions, and I know in Florida you're experts at water reuse and purple pipes, right? Trying to understand what types of water should be used, where and when and how. These are all really critical questions. And in fact, I think at Florida, you're really ahead of the curve when it comes to water reuse and in specific areas, especially for the environment, irrigation of grass and those kinds of things. So I'll tell you a little bit about a project that's called Conserve. This is a USDA funded center of excellence that's actually run out of the University of Maryland. Their mission is to really facilitate the adoption of transformative on-farm solutions. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the research that we're doing as well as some of the educational aspects. It's a great project in that it touches all different areas. So very multidisciplinary and a transdisciplinary team. And there's a link down here for a YouTube video, Water, Food, in Our World, that was made by New Mexico State University. It's a short video. There's a couple of them now that are really great. If you have an interest, you can look at those, or I'm happy to send you more links. There are multiple people that were working on this project, including New Mexico State University. So we're really blessed to have a great team, as well as international perspective from Israel. My group also does some work in terms of digital narrative development, and curriculum development. Down here, you can see some students working on a type of an escape room exercise for a laboratory where they're trying to put pieces of information together and come up with clues so they can unlock another clue and get to some sweet treats at the end of the game. We also have a lot of information that can go into classrooms. So if I can provide you with any of this, let me know. This is all about using water safely for food safety. And we have lovely young scientists and these digital narratives of them that teachers are using in their classrooms. So if I can provide you with any of that, please let me know. So what this team has done is over 2 years collected water from the same locations. And that was really a unique experience for all the grad students that were involved. They'd all get together on a Monday morning, drive all over Delmarva, collect water samples, bring them back, and share them. And so from this set of almost 300 samples, we have fewer for the protozoa that we're going to talk about in a minute. But from these different samples, we can look at the presence of Salmonella, Listeria monocytogenes, Shiga toxigenic E. coli, and these are all the other labs that are doing this work. And then my group was working on protozoa and viruses, really trying to see what kind of viruses can we detect in these waters and what kind of protozoa. And that's what we're going to talk about now as we think about One Health in terms of protozoa. So we've talked a little bit about bacteria, Salmonella, and we've talked about virus. So now we need to throw in another organism, right? So when we think about protozoa, this shows you relative size-wise what we're talking about. So virus is very small at 30 nanometers, and then we've got the bacteria, a micron or so, and then we get into these very large microorganisms where cyclospora is about 8 to 10 microns and cryptosporidium is about half of that. And of course, we know these are incredibly important microorganisms and cause quite a bit of health issues, especially when it comes to foods these days. So protozoa are single-celled organisms. They only divide in the host, so they use the food as the vehicle to get to the host. And here we're going to talk about humans being the host that we're really interested in. You can see they come in different shapes and sizes. So Giardia has those flagella. Cyclospora and cryptosporidium are different as well. Cyclospora is shed into the environment non-sporulated, so it needs some time in the environment before it becomes infectious. And scientists are still learning the biology about cyclospora. We don't really understand all of the cues that happen within this oocyst to let it undergo that sporulation where then it can become infectious. So one thing that always comes to mind when we think about protozoa and what's in the environment is the changes that we see in terms of food production. And this is just one aspect of that. If we think about why we raise animals for food the way we do, we want to maintain cleanliness and sanitation and animal health, right? And having pigs on cement is one way where we've been really able to stop the spread of animal diseases, right? And maintain that safety. But if we look at those ecosystems that, as I mentioned, consumers are driving, we see changes in that. We see less ability for us to be able to monitor and protect the animals from animal diseases. And many of those diseases are zoonotic. And so we see protozoa really important here. Toxoplasma gondii is very important. Helminth agents like trichinella are very important because we don't see those in some of our commercial flocks or commercial herds, but we might see them in these types of areas. So while this environment looks more appealing to a consumer, what we really need to think about in these backyard flocks, as we just mentioned, are the potential for disease transmission there. And of course, that's a difficult subject to broach when you think about consumer interests. So we'll get back to water now, thinking about those protozoa in the water. Again, using that water for all kinds of different things, our non-traditional waters, so irrigation water, or maybe even brewing beer, those kinds of things. We're seeing lots of potential reuse for water. So here's a bunch of data to kind of throw at you. Here we're looking at what cryptosporidium species that we detected in water, as well as cyclospora species. So we'll look just at cryptosporidium and talk about some of the different places that we collected this water, from ponds, from rivers. The reclaimed water was from lagoons, from wastewater treatment, and then also there was a produce wash water that we collected that had a little bit of everything. It was a lot of environmental waters that kind of came into this one facility. And so you can see about 36% of all overall water, we detected Cryptosporidium. Now this is Cryptosporidium species, so we haven't been able to go in and say that this is only Cryptosporidium hominis or Cryptosporidium parvum. And that's where these pictures of animals come in at the bottom of this slide. So Cryptosporidium is a zoonotic illness. So we have oocysts that can be shed by cattle and deer that can infect humans. While it's less likely that the oocysts shed by wild birds or our friends, our pets, our dogs and cats would infect humans, it has been recorded and is possible. And so some of the Cryptosporidium that we see in the environment may come from humans, and some may come from deer or cattle. Now, when we think about cyclospora, so we're seeing more and more scientists look for cyclospora in domesticated waters. Over the past couple of years, we've had some information come through from scientists suggesting that there is cyclospora that's coming in on domestically grown produce that might be linked to illness. And so scientists are looking at what cyclospora might be there. And when we did this work, we looked for cyclospora using filtration methods approved by the EPA. And of course, the FDA is changing those methods a little bit right now. The other thing that we want to note here is right now, I'm noting these as presumptively positive. We are in the midst of doing genetic sequencing to make sure that we can confirm that this is Cyclospora cayetanensis. We don't know if there are other cyclospora in these waters. There are cyclospora species that are not Cyclospora cayetanensis, and could that be out there? Could they be shed by other animals? We don't know that definitively yet. And so when it comes to detection of cyclospora in the environment, there are specific primers that are used. Some of them are more specific than others, and some might detect Eimeria. We think we've ruled out from these samples that they're not Eimeria, which is a closely related protozoan parasite that's rampant in chickens. And so, of course, in Delmarva, where we're collecting this water, we could have wash from poultry that could get into the waterways. But we'll know more in a couple months to be able to say whether or not very specifically, and that's why this is still unpublished data. But I wanted to share it with you because I know in Florida you've got certainly some interest in what's happening with cyclospora. So just a general reminder, we think about what's happening in the environment with cyclospora. We see the potential for oocysts to be there in water. It's not a zoonotic organism that we know of, so it is shed just by humans, and that's the current thinking. Still many biological questions remain, and there are several scientists around the world who are trying to ask those questions and better understand, again, what happens to cyclospora in the environment. And so we see in this image from the CDC, an oocyst that is sporulated is ingested. It goes through the human host, and in the intestine, it undergoes series of asexual reproductive cycles and sexual reproductive cycles, so that this oocyst is then shed in the feces. And this is an unsporulated oocyst. So you can see this is a massive cytoplasm here, where here you can see fully differentiated life stages that are called sporocysts, and those contain little banana-like creatures called sporozoites, and that's what's actually going to infect. So what happens between this unsporulated stage and this sporulated stage is really unknown. And I heard recently a scientist give a talk at USDA where they want to use some equipment to monitor metabolism and look at metabolism changes. People are trying to use Eimeria or toxoplasma as surrogates because you can produce those oocysts a little bit more easily and try to study those. Under cool temperatures, you can slow down this process from going from unsporulated to sporulated. So if we think about the cold chain that's so important to food production, while those foods, maybe they're contaminated, something like berries or basil as shown here, if you have that at cold temperatures, you might slow down that process, and maybe then people are consuming unsporulated oocysts, which would not be infectious. And so that's a possibility. We, of course, have a current outbreak that's going on right now. And this is the information that's been updated since August 14th, and that's the latest that's on the CDC website as of yesterday. I did not check this morning. So there are hundreds of cases that are out there, several hospitalizations as well. And potentially linked to this, right, is the finding of Cyclospora in water. And as I showed you, we maybe have potentially Cyclospora in waters here too, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that that was linked to that contamination event or to making those people sick. So we really have to understand more about what's going on in the environment. So to wrap this up, I thought we'd look at a little bit of data from FoodNet. This is looking at Cryptosporidium and Cyclospora by year, and you can see increases, right? These trends of increasing protozoal illnesses. And so getting back to One Health, really think we want to continue to think about what's going on in our environment and how does this, especially for Cryptosporidium, relate to what's going on with our animals as well. Certainly many of these crypto outbreaks are related to contaminated recreational water. With Cyclospora, we see more produce related. If we look at those infections by month, and you can pull up this type of data on this, the FoodNet FAST website, you can go in and ask the database just to show you specific organisms. And here you can see, we see seasonality for both. It makes sense when it's warmer, people are out in the water, perhaps interacting more with recreational waters. If we're outside in rivers, we have maybe more transmission by both humans and then animals in terms of Cryptosporidium. We still have this question, what about transmission routes, right? We really just don't have a very good understanding of that. And so we certainly need this One Health perspective when we look at various aspects of food safety and environmental health. Where does Cyclospora fit in? It's still kind of that conundrum. Where is it something that we really need to think about in the environment? If it's only the environment and human disease, right? How do we focus in on that? And so in summary, I hope that we all continue to keep making connections, thinking about ways to advance food safety, perhaps think about it from the lens of One Health if you haven't before. And I really want to thank you for the invitation to be here, for your attention, especially for your dedication to IEFP. And I look forward to seeing you all at our virtual meeting in October. And with that, if there's still time, I will take questions.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. So our first question, how do you communicate the trade-offs between intensive livestock production and ability to implement biosecurity versus more extensive production often perceived by the public as better for the animal?
Oh, that's an awesome question on so many levels, right? And I think part of that, I think the biosecurity is really important, right? So making sure that that's always there, either through signage. One aspect that popped in my mind with that question is even thinking about agritourism, right? And farms and fairs. We still want people to see animals. We want people to interact with animals, but you need to have some barriers there. We need to be able to do it in a way that the animals are protected and that humans are protected. In terms of food production, I think that's really hard. We need to try to get the science across at low levels if that's what's needed. Get people to understand that even if you think that, and this is where it's really hard because I see this with students as well as non-students, is does animals look happy, right? Happy, right? They look happy, they look safe, but we think about what diseases that might be there. It's really difficult. And we don't always have the veterinarians on our side. We see leaders in both fields kind of taking both sides, especially when it comes to issues like cages and rearing of animals, pregnant sows, those kinds of things. There's been so many different issues with that. So it's very complicated. But I think we need to continue at it, especially as we think more and more about the environment. And maybe it'll become easier for us to think about it after this episode that we've been going through in our lives, that we've seen the environment is so important. We really need to think about diseases and the environment together.
Thank
I
you.
didn't do a good job with that question. That's an excellent question.
Thank you, Jason. That was a good one. One more question. There was a lot of notoriety around rat lungworm disease a few years ago, and we haven't heard a lot more about that. Can you share anything else about that?
Yeah, so one of my students is very interested in that. And so we did look into that recently. I did not see, I believe I didn't see too many more cases that were happening, but yeah, that's another great example when we think about interactions with the environment. And I think in Florida, you've had some cases with that as well.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, that's another great example.
All right, I think that's all the questions for now. I'll hand it back to Jason.
Well, thank you for your excellent presentation. I'd just like to remind participants that we have at least one more webinar on September 16th on commissaries and ghost kitchens. We're looking at potentially having another one on the 30th. And then on October 13th, we're going to wrap up with our 2020 FAFP virtual meeting and awards ceremony. So please tune in there. And again, that's an opportunity to be involved with the organization. And we're going to recognize some of the achievement of some of our members. So with that, thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you in a couple weeks.